The entity paused and extended its crystal sensor, neither knowing nor caring that it was at the very edge of Federation space. Data defining the shape and content of the space surrounding it raced along the microscopically glittering pathways that honeycombed its vast interior. The entity modified its course, as it had done millions of times since its journey began, unaware that it was entering a domain called the neutral zone. It knew nothing of the great war that had ravaged both civilizations, nor of the buffer that had allowed an uneasy peace to be maintained for more than a human century. It was, after all, a machine. It could only continue to observe, to search, to learn, to protect, as it had been designed to do. Already at the very limit of the crystal sensor's range, another world was entering its awareness. Another world whose primitives, like those on the blue world it had recently departed, held promise. With a special alertness, it sought the voice of that distant world. It was still too distant to pick out individual voices or songs of the primitives. Normally, the full focus of the crystal sensor would have produced a soft but joyous symphony. But there was a change. An emotion its creators had called sadness. Perhaps despair. A single cry set the sensor dancing. A cry that rose simultaneously from all the primitives that still survived on that distant world. Save us. Captain's log, stardate 8488.7. I have reviewed with Commander Riley the procedures to be followed once in orbit around Tamaris 4. The first face-to-face meetings will be on the planet's surface, no weapons. All personnel who beam down are to have their communicators, and transporter chiefs will keep a fix on each of us at all times. Meetings will continue, alternating between the ships until some kind of agreement is reached or both sides have had enough. On the first evening, Federation musicians will perform on the Enterprise, followed the next evening by Romulan musicians performing on the Galtige. Both Riley and I are worried that Dr. Bernard, having seen several of her closest friends tortured and killed by Romulans, might not be able to handle working cheek to jowl with a batch of Romulans. So I have asked Mr. Sulu to be an archaeological sitter and stick close to Dr. Bernard. I am worried that the Romulans' insistence on Dr. Bernard's being in charge could be less an attempt to make up for their earlier offenses than to exploit them in some way to sabotage the conference. A short while ago, I received word from Spock that the probe had crossed the neutral zone and re-entered Romulan space, doubling its velocity. Starfleet passed on this information to the Romulan Interim Committee, which curtly denied the probe's existence. Meanwhile, Spock has made no real progress with the probe recordings. On a rise overlooking the desert-like remains of what had once been a terraced, fertile valley, Kirk stood with Spock, Sulu, Riley, and Bernard. They faced 4 stiffly formal Romulans. Beyond them in the valley proper, the ruins of Tamaris 4 stretched almost to the sandy horizon. The conspicuous absence of fanfare reinforced Kirk's opinion that the Romulans wanted to imply that the conference was unimportant to them. When the introductions were over, Dejan and Dr. Bernard, escorted by an enthusiastic Sulu, escaped to survey a few square meters of the ruins. Centurion Tiam stood watching, silent and tense, next to a seemingly relaxed Riley. The one remaining Romulan, a sub-centurion introduced as Kital stood solemnly to one side, his eyes tracking Sulu and the two archaeologists as if his life depended on it. Hyan turned to Kirk, as if on a sudden impulse. "It appears there will be precious little to occupy you and me on this mission, Captain Kirk. I would be honored to conduct you on a tour of my ship, if you will do the same for me." Centurion Tiam remained silent, watching and listening. A cold smile shaped the corners of his mouth. Kirk looked Hyan straight in the eye and hoped he was not making a mistake. "I'll personally escort you, Commander Hyan." Kirk surveyed the mixture of colorful costumes and regulation Starfleet issue, all swimming in an unintelligible hubbub of voices. On the surface, this first reception, in the most spacious wreck deck the Enterprise had to offer, was a genuine miracle after 100 years of cold and sometimes not-so-cold war. Even Dr. Bernard, though she had yet to join in with anything so un-Vulcan as laughter, appeared comfortable. Kirk's only moment of fright had come not from Bernard, but from a stout, silver-haired Catalan female who had been repeatedly poking a lanky Romulan male in the chest to emphasize her point. Just when Kirk expected the Romulan to draw back in anger, he exploded in laughter instead. On the other hand, there was Tian, like an iceberg in the shipping lanes. Even Riley had given up after uncounted attempts at small talk. Commander Hyan, at his observation post immediately to Kirk's right, let go a sigh. "My pet diplomat seems to be behaving in a decidedly undiplomatic manner. You will excuse me, Kirk, while I have a word with him." "By all means, Commander. No one likes a party pooper." Kirk wondered what Romulan equivalent the translator in Hyan's ear would supply. Whatever it was, it seemed to delight him because he laughed. "That is priceless, Kirk. I shall remember it at my next staff meeting." So saying, Hyan navigated the throng and spoke quietly in Tiam's ear. The Centurion stiffened, his eyes flashing, but finally, gritting his teeth, he nodded. Finally, it was time for the music. A solo piano recital by Maestro Andrew Pennault. Acknowledging the polite applause, Pennault seated himself, signaled for the computerized orchestral accompaniment he had arranged for, and began to play. Thunderously, spectacularly, all sparkle and dazzle and flying fingers. When he finished, he stood with a flourish and bowed to the applause. Kirk turned to Uhura. "At least he's good, isn't he?" Uhura grinned at the captain. "He has to be pretty good to do all that flailing around and still hit most of the right notes." As the applause died down, Kirk noticed with alarm that Tiam was heading for the platform. Pennault looked equally alarmed as the Romulan bore down on him. Belatedly, Kirk tried to intercept Tiam, who strode onto the platform, his hand extended, not as a threat, but as an invitation to the human ritual of a handshake. "A brilliant performance, Maestro Pennault." "Well, thank you, Ambassador Tiam. Coming from you, that's quite a compliment. I understand your wife is a musician as well." "She is, in fact. She is the reason I have taken the liberty of approaching you. You see, the piano is one of her favorite instruments. Your playing has so inspired her that she was wondering if she might indulge herself with this one. Well, of course, Ambassador. And Penalt strode quickly to where Jandra stood and took her arm. For a moment she nervously resisted, casting a dark look at her husband. But then the scattered applause from the Federation musicians began. She smiled, took Penalt's arm, and allowed herself to be escorted to the piano. She sat motionless for a moment, then brushed her fingers soundlessly across the keys. For several seconds she sat with her eyes closed, giving Kirk for just a moment the unreal impression that she was somehow mind-melding with the instrument. Then she looked up at Penalt. "The piece you concluded with. Now, would your computer have the accompaniment for the second movement?" Penalt nodded. "The program is designed to follow the lead of the player." A moment later, the computer accompaniment began. The Jandra played without a single false start or misstep. Where Penalt had thrown his entire body into the playing, Jandra remained almost eerily motionless as her fingers coaxed the sound from the keys. She let the sound drift out and envelop her listeners, and then she drew them in. When she lifted her fingers from the keys at the conclusion, there was total silence. Then the applause broke out, and Sulu, next to Kirk, laughed as he joined the others. "She's as good as Penalt thinks she is." Kirk looked around to locate Penalt. If he had looked a second later, he would have seen only the maestro's broad smile. But in that first second, he saw the mixture of fury and humiliation that had not yet been completely obscured. His smile now firmly in place, Penalt bounded back onto the platform. He took Jandra's hand as she stood up from the piano. "That was stunning, my lady. Absolutely stunning. Ambassador Tiam, your wife's performance has given new urgency to your mission. You and your colleagues must succeed, if only so that her gifts may be shared with the worlds of the Federation. I would be honored to be her sponsor and advisor." Even Tiam seemed taken aback by Penalt's effusiveness. "Jandra and I thank you, Maestro Penalt, and we will do our best in the coming days not to disappoint the Federation." From a far corner of the room, a pair of Romulans in the uniform of sub-centurions watched with well-disguised pleasure the exchange on the platform. The older one spoke softly to the younger. "We could not have asked for better. If their late brother's activities did not provide sufficient motive for Federation revenge, this public humiliation of one of their own will leave no doubt whatsoever." Back on the Galtige, Jandra realized that her decision had been made, without knowing precisely when. Certainly not when that buffoon Penalt had made his offer. Perhaps it had been the crowd afterward, not as they told her how much they had been moved by her performance, but as they lingered to talk of other things, to inquire about her life, her own happiness. Her decision had been made. But it still had to be carried out, and the first step, perhaps the hardest of all, would be to talk to Dejan. She dared not simply make her move, leaving him to face the consequences. About Tiam, she was not worried. Whatever became of him, it would be his due. Bracing herself, she moved down the corridor to her brother's quarters. She was startled by the suddenness with which the door snapped open. "Little sister, come in. I was right, you see. They wished to flaunt you, to prove Romulan superiority even in such lesser activities as music." Jandra was afraid that her momentary burst of courage that had allowed her to rap at her brother's door would desert her, and she would never get it back. "I must speak with you, brother. I have decided to defect to the Federation." For a long moment there was only silence. Her brother's face was frozen, his mouth still open with unspoken words. Suddenly, he laughed and snatched her off her feet, hugging her and whirling her about the tiny room. "You have remarkable timing, just like a musician. I have been pacing the floor for hours, it seems, trying to work up the courage to tell you precisely the same thing." The next morning, Dr. Bernard and the Romulan archaeologist Dejan stood next to the prefab headquarters at the mouth of the valley as their team spread out and began threading their way as rapidly as practical through the ruins. The evening before, the reception shop talk had led quickly to an agreement to pair off Romulan and Federation, so that during the initial survey each pair would have the use of a tricorder, which the Romulan archaeologists readily admitted were superior to their own devices. Everyone had leapt into action virtually the moment they were beamed down. First, they made a fast survey of the entire valley, with all tricorder readings transferred to both Enterprise and Galtige computers at the end of each day. Then they set out to concentrate on the most promising areas. To Bernard's eyes, this decaying gray world with a feeble sun, dim and forbidding, was stunningly beautiful. Yet she was finding that if she closed her eyes, it was all too easy to imagine that she stood amid the ruins of Callus III with a different Romulan at her side. Like most Romulans, Dejan was shorter and slighter of build than the average Vulcan. His coloring was lighter. Pale curling hair framed a face set with dark green eyes. Audria decided that he had to be the fraternal twin of the musician Jandra. He was handsome, by either human or Romulan standards, although that obviously meant nothing. The Romulan in charge on Callus III had been even more handsome, and his clinical torture and butchery of her friends and colleagues and brother had literally stolen her sanity. Only the Vulcans had been able to help her reclaim her mind, and more, they had taught her the mind rules. She had achieved a halting mastery over her emotions and had dealt with her rage, her hatred. She had attained a measure of peace. But now, with the Romulan actually standing beside her, close enough to reach out and touch, his features echoing those of that other, she felt it all coming back. The fear, the hatred, the loathing that had built up in her during that year on Callus. The fear she could control. It was an animal reaction, a function of the lower brain and easily dealt with. The hatred was more difficult. In that year, her mantra had been, "I will survive to see you dead." And it had worked. But this was a different world, a different time, and that hatred, if uncontrolled, could steal from her the opportunity of a lifetime. Most of all, it was illogical. Dejan was not responsible for the events on Callus III. He was, after all, an archaeologist like herself. not a military tyrant and torturer like the creature on Callus III. She turned and began striding toward the beginnings of the hills that flanked and protected the valley. "Come, Dejan, there is a structure I would find before all others. The Exodus Hall." Together they made their way higher, the powder-fine sand squeaking softly under their boots. Sometime later, they were more than a mile from the mouth of the valley, looking down from one of the highest points in the westward hills. The dozen pairs of Federation and Romulan archaeologists in the ruins below looked like insects scurrying through an unending maze. Benar pointed toward a segment of the ruins near the far side of the valley. "This is one of the nodes." Dejan followed her finger with his eyes, searching the ruins. "Yes, I see it now. Remarkable, Dr. Benar. I would never in 1,000 years have recognized that for what it is." Within minutes, she had located another principal node, and a feeling of triumph was coursing through her, almost drowning out the ever-distant cries of Callus III. And the Exodus Hall. It was there, double the size of any she had seen before, and the most intact structure in the valley. Forgetting to inform her partner, she began to make her way down the slope. "Remarkable, Captain." Hyan's smile indicated a soft-edged envy of the trees and grass that lined the winding paths of the Enterprise Botanical Garden. The guided tour had, at Hyan's request, gotten underway early, before the first working diplomatic meeting, which was set to begin on the Galtige at 0900. Hyan did not want his so far friendly relationship with Kirk to be complicated by Tiam's opening salvos on the diplomatic front. Hyan shook his head in wonder. "Truly remarkable. But tell me, Captain Kirk, do you hold any hopes for this ferry boat ride we are both on?" "Hopes? Yes. Expectations? No." The Romulan eyed Kirk as if debating whether to go on. "I will tell you honestly, Federation Captain, my hopes were higher at the start of the ride, before I became familiar with Centurion Tiam. Does that surprise you?" Kirk smiled. "Only that you admit it." "Then I will admit something else, and this just may surprise you. It is my secret hope that the archaeologists determine that the Arisians were the ancestors of you humans. Then my government would be obliged by its own terms to give the Federation access to this world. We will be responsible for carving the first path through the forest of the neutral zone." "I hope my own government would see it in the same light if the Arisians prove to be your ancestors." "As do I. But tell me, Kirk, now that we are exchanging confidences, how real is this so-called probe my government denies?" "Very real, Hyan, and very dangerous." "Indeed? You have seen it personally?" "I have, and I have heard it. I have seen what it can do. I could show you the records, as we have offered to show your government." "And I would be glad to look, but I fear it would not change anything. Tiam will no more listen to me than to you, nor would those whose orders he follows. Whoever forced the selection of Centurion Tiam was no friend to reform, I tell you." Startled at such openness, Kirk wondered if this Hyan were genuine. He looked up to see Hyan tentatively touch a booted toe to the grass at the edge of the path. Is it permitted to depart from the paths? It's not encouraged, but it's certainly permitted, particularly for a distinguished guest such as yourself. Leading the way, Kirk moved off the path onto the grass. Commander Riley entered the Galtige conference room at 0900. He had not, truth be told, slept all that well last night. On the other hand, Centurion Tiam and his 4 aides looked thoroughly alert and rested. Riley took his place at the conference table, a small tricorder before him. He had spent the last few days filling his head with Romulan psychology, attitudes, beliefs. But little of it, he suspected, would prove useful in dealing with Tiam. As always, Riley found himself preparing to rely on something which, in their own disparate ways, both Captain Kirk and Ambassador Sarek had advised him to rely upon a long time ago: his instincts. And this time instinct told Kevin Riley, start with a reality check. He and TM could spout polite or not-so-polite platitudes at each other all day, but none of it would mean a thing unless both sides were operating in the same universe. And the Romulan interim government's initial response to the data concerning the probe's movement toward Romulan territory was prima facie evidence that someone in the interim government was not operating in the real universe. The government had denied twice that the probe existed.
Ambassador TM, we have received only hours ago new data regarding the location and course of the object we have unofficially designated the probe. Are you familiar with that object?
Tiam's face displayed a moderate scowl.
I am, of course, familiar with the fiction the Federation is attempting to perpetrate. What I fear I am not familiar with is the reason the Federation persists in its attempts.
Oh, we persist, Ambassador TM, for the same reason I persist in sitting in this chair rather than falling through it to the floor. The chair exists. The probe exists. It has done major damage to Earth. It has now passed through the neutral zone and has entered, possibly re-entered, Romulan space.
Re-entered, Commander Riley? Are you now claiming this fiction of yours originated in the Empire?
Not at all, Ambassador TM. If we thought it had, I doubt that we would be sitting here today.
Very well, then, Commander Riley. If you are not accusing the Romulan Empire of anything, I see no point in discussing it further.
Riley slid a paper across the table toward the Romulans.
These are the most recent coordinates. The probe will soon be beyond the range of Federation ships, so any further tracking will be up to the Empire.
So, Commander Riley, you have turned this fiction over to us. Is that what you're saying?
Riley paused. This was going nowhere.
What I am saying, Ambassador TM, is that the probe is not a fiction. I fail to see any point in trying to discuss any of the countless other issues about which there is ample room for legitimate differences of opinion. We would simply be wasting our time.
And with that, Riley stood up from the table and strode from the room. Though it was a little more than 3 kilometers from their hilltop vantage point to the structure identified as the Exodus Hall, it took Bernard and Dejan more than an hour to reach it, partly because there was no such thing as a direct route. Walking the streets, they could sense that patterns existed, could come around a curve and see some aspect of the ruins the patterns had told them to expect. Then the Exodus Hall appeared before them.
After a single survey around the squat, low-domed building, Benar took from her kit a small, short-range phaser-like device. Its normal use was in extracting fossils from the rock strata in which they were found. 10 careful minutes with this device could replace dozens of hours with tiny picks, tweezers, and brushes. Setting it to full power, she brought it within an inch of what the tricorder told her was the weakest section of the walls. She pressed the activator and heard the faint whine as the first layer of the wall surface disappeared in the greenish glow. She heard the sandy shuffle of feet behind her, and Audrey Benar clamped down on a scream as visions of another time crashed down on her. Visions she had hoped that the years on Vulcan had forever banished. She was inside a structure, not outside, and the footsteps were echoing in the corridor outside her room, her cell, and she knew that Delar was coming for her once again. Something touched her shoulder, and she spun and saw Delar's hated face above her, and she lurched to her feet, raising the excavating tool and thrusting it at him, screaming her fury and confused terror. When Sulu looked up from his studies on the Arisian ascendancy, he realized he should have instructed the computer to interrupt him when the archaeological teams beamed down. They had already been on the surface for half an hour. He darted from his quarters and headed for the transporter room at a run. "You have a bead on Dr. Benar?" The ensign at the controls did some checking. "Yes, she's down in the middle of the ruins, sir." "Ensign, don't put me down right on top of her. Give me some distance." Sulu didn't want to startle Benar or make her think he was keeping an eye on her, although that was exactly what he was doing. When the transporter field released him, Benar and Dejan were in clear view, their backs to him. Benar was using an excavating tool of some kind. As Sulu approached, Benar kneeled down and held the tool close to the wall. The Romulan took a step closer, leaning down to watch more closely. As he did, his kit brushed against her shoulder. Sulu was only yards away, getting ready to call out a casual greeting, when Benar stiffened and screamed an animal-like mixture of screech and growl. She swung about, swinging the still-glowing tool toward the Romulan's face. Sulu lunged forward as best he could in the sand. The Romulan was backing away while Benar lurched forward, jabbing the excavating tool at his face. "Delar!" she shouted. Sulu grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms at her side. For an instant, her body writhed and struggled bruisingly. Then, in a split second, she stopped, held herself totally motionless. She went limp. The weapon fell to the sand. Sulu maintained his grip on Benar while he looked at the Romulan. "Dejan, what the hell's going on here?" Dejan's face was ashen, as if he were going into shock. Dr. Benar shuddered. "Commander Sulu, you can now release me. I have recovered." Tentatively, he let her go and looked from one to the other. "So, one of you want to clue me in?" The Romulan looked at Sulu. "She called me Delar." Sulu looked to Benar, who gave a slight nod. "On Callus 3, for a moment," she looked at Dejan, "I will be more careful in the future." Dejan had gone even paler. "You were on Callus 3? For a long moment, the Romulan was silent. He closed his eyes to bring his labored breathing and pounding heart under control. Finally, he looked at Benar, lowering his eyes as he spoke. Delar was the commander of the forces on Kalas 3. He was also my brother. From a vantage point 100 meters from the Exodus Hall, 2 Romulans, their sub-centurion uniforms replaced by the nondescript garb favored by the archaeologists, quietly retreated. If not for the intervention of the Enterprise commander, one major part of their mission would have been complete. Had she been allowed to kill or seriously injure Delar's brother, it would have been relatively simple to dispose of her and arrange it to look as if they had killed each other. But now, knowing what Benar with her Vulcan logic was capable of, she would almost certainly take precautions. The older one said, "We will find another means of ending this charade." Once out of sight and sound of the Exodus Hall, they signaled to be transported back to the Galtige. Sulu paced in the sand as Benar worked to breach the wall of the Exodus Hall. Everyone had been counting on the conference, and consequently the dig, to last at least several days. But now, some faction among the Romulans was deliberately trying to sabotage it. Despite Dr. Benar's flashback to her time on Kalas 3, she had insisted on continuing to work with Dejan, and he had agreed. Both were aware that this unique opportunity could vanish at any moment. Sulu turned to Dejan.
"I was giving myself a crash course on Origins this morning, but I hadn't got to the part about the Exodus Halls yet."
Dejan seemed relieved to speak, to take his mind off waiting. "The theory, Commander, is that the contents of the hall may tell us where the Origins went. All appear to have been domed, as this is, and the dome fragments appear to contain segments of a star map, with certain of the stars highlighted."
"Like a planetarium?"
Benar looked over her shoulder from where she still used the excavating tool on a thinning surface of the wall. "A static mosaic of stars, unless their science was even further beyond ours. The coordinates of the highlighted stars may be held in a crystalline memory device. A number have been found in other Exodus halls, but little information has been recovered from them. The fields used to encode the data have been so weakened that the bulk of the data was lost." It seemed hours later to Sulu when he stood with Dr. Benar and Dejan inside the Exodus Hall, looking up at its domed ceiling. In the light of the halogen lamp, thousands of tiny points of light and hundreds of brighter ones glittered above them. In the exact center on a pedestal was a miniature duplicate of the dome, with only the highlighted stars visible. Benar went directly to the pedestal, her tricorder out. "Intact. The crystalline lattice structure is stable. The magnetic field is faint, but not erratic. We may have little time. Kurdejan, it is my opinion that the instruments aboard the Enterprise would have a better chance of retrieving the data than those aboard the Romulan ship. Do you agree?" Dejan gestured at the Romulan instrument in his hand, a primitive version of a tricorder. "I have no objection, though Tiam and the others might." "We will not tell them until it is done. Commander Sulu, it will be safest to transport the crystalline device in a shuttle." Sulu flipped open his communicator to start making the arrangements.